Water gnawed at the stone like teeth, brown and rising, turning the creek into a throat that swallowed sound. The boy's small frame lay wedged beneath a tilted slab, pulse flickering in his neck like a hummingbird's wing. The dog planted himself between current and child, a living barricade, chest braced, paws grinding into gravel until his nails burned. Every surge slammed into his flank and broke around him in sheets of cold effort. He lowered his head to keep the boy's face in a pocket of air, shoulders trembling, breath short and hot against wet fur. A siren wailed somewhere too far away. The man slid down the bank with a practiced calm that disguised urgency, scanning angles, distances, collapse lines. The dog did not look back. He absorbed the river, inch by murderous inch, and held the line because there was nothing else in the world to do. Hours earlier, heat lay over Brimwood like a held breath, and the shelter smelled of bleach, tin bowls, and the stale hope of second chances. He walked in with the posture of someone who had worn weight and learned to move under it. He asked for the dog no one wanted, then set his eyes on the last kennel where warnings accumulated like rust. The shepherd inside did not stand, did not bark, did not sell himself. Scars mapped his coat with a cartographer's patience, one ear notched, one eye a harder amber, the other softened by a film of old injury. The paperwork moved, ink settling like a verdict. A muzzle was removed with reverent caution. The shepherd lifted a paw, slow as a confession, set it into a waiting palm and allowed the first fragile treaty of the day to be written in silence.
The rental on Larkspur Street had the undecorated feel of a life paused between storms. A folded flag waited on a shelf the way a memory waits at a locked door. The dog took inventory like a professional. Corners first, then thresholds, then the places where a footstep might echo. He claimed negative space behind the couch, eyes on the front door, breath shallow enough to erase himself. The man made distance into courtesy, kitchen into sanctuary, noise into something carefully predictable. A bed went down in shadow, bowls in a triangle of light, water catching the reflection of moving clouds. The dog would not eat under a gaze, would not drink while watched, would not sleep where sleep could be witnessed. By morning, the kibble vanished, and the hiding place shifted 2 feet closer to the heartbeat that had not tried to touch him. Night arrived with the soft hum of the air unit and the hard edges of an old theater the mind insists on replaying. Sand lifted in slow motion across a road that pretended to be empty. A dog named Axel snapped his head, muscles strung like wires, a half-breath warning before the world inverted. The man woke to the smell of cordite that wasn't there and the heavy absence of a partner who had absorbed what the earth intended for him. In the quiet Brimwood room, the shepherd's ears twitched at the shift in breathing and padded closer, still a silhouette, still uncommitted. He settled on the floor where a hand could fall by accident and find fur. Not contact, just proximity. The kind of nearness battle-sick hearts barter for when touch is too expensive and distance costs even more.
Morning brought cicadas and the slow kingdom of a southern neighborhood. Evelyn watched over a cup that steamed like a sermon and inventoried neighbors with the serene efficiency of someone who refused to retire from caring. She clocked the man's gait, the favoring of the left knee in the first 3 steps, the dog's triangular sweep of vision whenever a bicycle chain clicked. She named it trouble without malice, then measured the size of it against the size of her patience. A casserole found its way into the man's hands later, as if food were a form of permission. She said little, but her presence shoved the street an inch toward safety. The dog regarded her from the doorway, weight balanced to retreat if needed. No welcome, no warning, watchfulness only. The sort that knows storms before clouds agree to form. At the shelter, Ava's desk preserved the small wars of a thin budget. line items like sandbags, grants like late rain, the kind of arithmetic that calculates mercy against time. She remembered the shepherd's intake photos, the hip bones like parentheses, the scars that looked deliberate, the tremor under the skin when a metal gate clanged. Reports flagged incidents that smelled like provocation dressed as evidence. She kept a separate file in her head for dogs whose eyes signaled sentences they could not serve alone. When the man called with a steady voice and a list of careful questions, she answered with logistics and softened advice, then stayed late to recheck the rabies tag, the microchip trail, the forgotten note scrawled by an officer who had written one word in the margin beside the shepherd's number, military, underlined once, then left to gather dust.
Day 5 broke a little earlier, light rinsing the living room with the low gold of near dawn. The man read aloud without performing, a paragraph at a time, sentences evenly spaced like stakes in good ground. A pan clattered by accident and did not end the world. The dog flinched, ran calculations, then returned to the threshold he had claimed as his courtroom. When the bowl went down that evening, the man did not step back as far. The shepherd looked, measured the difference, and risked the distance. Chew by chew, he ate under witness, one eye on the hand that would not move, one ear canted toward the door as if escape were a religious obligation. The bowl emptied, the water line fell, and a tail moved once without permission before becoming still as a kept secret. Sunlight shifted and found what night had hidden. Small circular marks puckered into the flank like a constellation no one wishes to name. Burns had a geometry, and cruelty wore its own handwriting. The man's jaw set without sound, and an old muscle memory reached for tools he had sworn to put down. He noted posture changes when chain links chimed, a flared nostril when a neighbor swung a bat at nothing but summer air, a refusal to cross the garage threshold where a coiled length of cable hung from a nail. Trauma annotated the map of the house, marking no-go zones and fragile passages. He recorded these coordinates in a private ledger the way handlers once recorded wind direction and scent cones, then folded the page closed like a prayer he did not let leave his mouth. From the street came the small sonic boom of joy, a boy's laugh that bounced off mailboxes and turned late afternoon into a place you could stand. The shepherd rose without thinking, drifted to the window and held still with an intensity that trimmed years from his face. Ears forward, mouth soft, a question caught between breaths. The man watched the animal watch the world and saw a guard posture that did not threaten, only measured. It lasted seconds, then broke, as if pleasure were a contraband he feared being caught with. The boy's sneakers slapped past, laces wild. A baseball thudded against a glove, and the dog's chest rose in a steadying breath. Something in the room grew a fraction warmer, an unspoken permission to believe in ordinary sounds again, even when ordinary had once been bait for pain. The old collar carried fatigue like an odor. Leather cracked where teeth had worried it through long waits and bad days. Under the worn lining, a hard shape pressed its argument. Metal slid free with the slow care reserved for relics. Numbers stamped with the authority of institutions. USMC, K9’17. The man rubbed grime away with a thumb until letters surfaced, faint as an admission. His mind stitched past and present with the speed of habit. Training fields under desert sun. Commands learned in 2 languages. The exquisite stillness of a dog thinking. He turned the tag once, then again, as if angles could unlock additional facts. The shepherd watched him without blinking, presiding over his own archaeology, neither flinching nor stepping forward. The room felt smaller, the future tighter, and somewhere a dim thread connected to a name he did not want to remember.
A partial name hid in the steel like a bruise under skin. M. Morgan. Blurred by time and friction, but legible enough to oxygenate an old dread. Memory offered the scent of motor oil and coffee, a laugh that never reached the eyes, a training correction delivered half a beat too long. Possibility arranged itself into a shape the man refused to accept without confirmation. He set the tag on the table, centered, solemn, then walked the house with a restlessness that annoyed his knee. The shepherd shadowed at a polite distance, the way soldiers learn to follow without obligating. In the mirror, the man took inventory, sun lines deepened by a year of trying to heal, a jaw calibrated to keep certain words inside. Outside, wind huffed through pine, and Brimwood reset its face to ordinary. The first public walk began in the mid-morning quiet, when fishermen argued softly with water and dragonflies wrote cursive no one could read. The dog moved in a low heel, leash loose, eyes mapping every angle where a person might emerge, every sudden sparkle of movement that could be threat or harmlessness. At the far bend, a child squatted by the reeds, studying a turtle with the gravity children give small lives. The shepherd's head tilted, the scanning halted, and his body softened with an almost visible exhale. He stepped forward 2 paces, then stopped himself as if a rule book hovered nearby. The man felt the change ripple up the leash like a conveyed thought. The child lifted his head, and 2 gazes held across 6 careful feet, each taking the other's measure in the bright democracy of daylight.
A shadow crossed the sun, simple as someone blocking light. Boots pushed gravel, and the air pressed flatter with a known pressure. The shepherd froze, weight pitched forward, tail low, pupils darkening to coins. The man did not need the face to recognize the shape of power used carelessly. The name came later, wrapped in recollection and the sour aftertaste of old respect gone wrong. The dog's growl stayed locked in his chest, an engine idle that promised acceleration. The angle of the other man's shoulders hinted at confrontation rehearsed for years. The boy blinked between them, confusion lifting like fog into fear. When the figure was gone, the dog remained wired, panting in shallow bursts, sweat smell and aftershave stored in his deep archive under a file labeled hazard. The afternoon never recovered its ease. Brimwood's council chamber turned budgets into weather. Ava argued for oxygen with the controlled cadence of someone who had turned compassion into policy. Across the aisle, cuts arrived wrapped in numbers and the theater of efficiency. The dog lay at the man's boot, pulse steady, eyes sweeping. A calm island others circled with curiosity and doubt. A chair creaked and the shepherd's ears twitched, then resumed their neutral carriage. When tension spiked, the man's hand lowered and hovered above fur without landing, a contact implied rather than demanded. The room learned something it didn't expect to learn. A dog certain people called dangerous recalibrated itself amid scraped chairs and wonky microphones, behaved with a predictability the human debate could not match, and altered, by inches, a town's appetite for easy conclusions.
A stack of documents slid. A voice rose. An elbow jabbed the air as if belief could be punctured into compliance. The shepherd moved only once, a small reposition to give his handler a cleaner line of sight to the exits, then settled into mission stillness. When the meeting exhaled toward intermission, someone brushed too close to the boy who had slipped in against instruction. The dog lifted his head, read posture, watched hands, and placed himself precisely between small ribs and big decisions. Not bristling, not brandishing, simply existing where he needed to exist. The man marked the behavior with a barely visible nod. In another life, there would have been a reward, a single soft word. Here, in the sanctuary of restraint, the currency was shared breath and the absence of panic. Days in Brimwood pivot on voices that never asked permission to matter. Evelyn rose at a civic meeting with the patience of a living archive. She told the room what towns forget when fear offers a shortcut, that mercy had spreadsheets too, that investment was a quiet wager with time, that monsters are often misnamed by those who need them to be simple. Her words pushed through the stale air and found the places where opinions wobble. The dog blinked at the cadence, tail thumping once in a rhythm that matched the man's heart rate coming down. Outside, sirens were just sound, and inside, math turned human again. When the vote closed, the shelter's lifeline held. The win was small by national standards and enormous by local ones. On the way out, the dog sniffed a child's hand and was allowed to finish.
Sleep slid out from under the man like a rug yanked by a prankster. Kandahar reassembled its broken geometry with brutal fidelity. Heat rose, metal sang, light shattered into knives, and a dog's silhouette occupied the last calm 2 seconds in the universe. He woke damp, chest tight, palms empty of the weight they sought. On the floor, the shepherd had moved closer without triggering any alarms, head just under the drop line of a hand. The hand fell, found the honest language of fur, and stayed. Breathing synchronized, room temperature balanced, night conceded its grip by degrees. Across the wall, headlights drew a soft white ladder that climbed away to somewhere more forgiving. For the first time in too long, morning felt possible before it arrived. Patterns arrange themselves if you let them. The tag, the name, the smell at the lake, the dog's refusal to cross the garage line where a shock collar once hung from a nail like an accusation. The man wrote it out in pencil, because pencil forgives revisions. He weighed the likelihood that the shepherd had lived in the house of the man by the water, endured a program built on breaking rather than building, and chosen protection anyway when small bones were at stake. The line from then to now ran through a boy's laugh and ended, for the moment, at a door the future had not yet opened. The dog lay stretched against the baseboard, eyes half closed, the twitch of dream thought in his paws. Somewhere inside his old training, a new mission rewrote itself. Absence has a unique silence. Police radios filled it with clipped phrases, neighbors with speculation, school hallways with a collective pulse that missed a beat. The boy did not arrive home, and the map of Brimwood curled at the edges under a breathless heat. The man watched the shepherd pace 3 steps and stop, nose tasting wind, head lifted as if listening to a frequency civilians cannot buy. The chief drew a boundary around liability and then erased it with an exhausted hand. The dog sat and waited for a command he remembered before remembering how to doubt. The man knelt, presented the denim cuff that still held the boy's smaller weather, and the dog closed his eyes once as if in prayer before opening them to work. Authority moved like a tired tide across the school parking lot, retreating from decisions, returning to cover the same ground. Time removed options with casual cruelty. The chief, a practical man who had learned his job by surviving it, conceded to the logic of the animal he didn't completely trust. The shepherd inhaled the scent article with ritual care, applicant to a vocation he had not asked for and could not abandon. He stepped off with a confidence that acknowledged risk. The man matched stride as if leashes could be held at the level of intention. They crossed the threshold where tidy lawn allowed the first brush of wild. The boy's trail brightened like chalk in rain. The woods spoke old dialects, pine resin and wet earth, rust and wildlife musk, a recently crushed fern sending up its emergency. The shepherd quartered the path with method, nose low, then head up on the gusts, cataloging disruptions, ignoring the tempting footnotes of rabbits and soda cans.
His body changed shape when the trail clarified. Angles sharpening, spine lengthening, movement turning into a kind of whisper. A crow heckled from the canopy. The man tasted copper and adrenaline and did not let breath get fancy. Behind them, civilization thinned to a rumor of tires on asphalt and someone calling a name into a space that did not intend to answer. Ruins carried intentions to the present. Concrete ribs, iron ribs, ribs of a past utility the town had outgrown and then forgotten. The pump house crouched by the swollen creek like a bad idea. The dog circled, reading the structure's posture, pausing at hairline cracks, pausing longer at a place where damp had achieved permanence. He pawed once at a seam and flattened an ear to the ground, listening for the language of water and boy. The man measured load-bearing and failure points, guessing at where the old drains ran under the slope. A small whimper lifted from earth, thin as floss, and vanished. The dog's head snapped toward a collapsed corner where the soil sagged, as if recently set back in place by hurried hands.
The access gap offered an invitation and a warning. Cold air breathed out, smelling of rust, algae, and the stubborn sweetness of rotting leaves. The shepherd lowered himself into the angle with precise economy, every movement written in the grammar of not making things worse. The tunnel cupped sound and fed it back as a heartbeat. Inside, water licked at concrete, the steady accretion of inconvenience toward catastrophe. The man shouted nothing, because silence was safer. He marked the distance with his eyes until the dog's outline broke into darkness. A breath later, a pressure sound changed, the kind that says a body has found another body. On the surface, the creek shouldered past its own banks, making the minutes meaner. He went in when calculation weighed less than consequence. The chamber widened enough to curse a second time the person who had built it that small. There, the boy, pale and shaking, leg pinned under a broken collar of pipe, water inching toward a deadline. There, the dog, chest to current, damming with his body, pushing back just enough to keep air where it belonged. The man moved rocks, tested shift, dismissed bad options, found a narrow calculus that read not safe, but necessary. He wedged a board, levered weight, and listened to the structure argue. The dog's eyes were bright and steady, asking nothing, granting everything. Together, three living things made a geometry the river had not yet learned to solve, and time, insulted, slowed one fraction.
Rescuers arrived with pumps and straps and protocols. In the overlap between seconds and intervention, the boy spoke in a thin, drained monotone of truths unasked for. The dog had once slept beside his bed, had carried a toy in his mouth and never chewed it, had stood between his small ribs and the rising temper of a man who called cruelty by names that made it sound like science. The dog had bled for it and disappeared for it. The man listened without moving his eyes from the pipe and reran a timeline with this missing chapter inserted. The dog shifted to brace as the slab lifted a hair and a breath entered the chamber that everyone had been too disciplined to request. The hole spit them back into daylight with the wet triumph of birth. The boy rode a backboard wrapped in silver that made him look lunar and brave. The dog climbed second, head low, muscles quivering, fur laid flat by water and will. Applause found them, that communal relief disguised as celebration. The chief's eyes changed in a way that could not be mistaken for anything but recalibration. Reporters angled toward sound bites and found only the clean facts of survival. The dog shook once, spraying the circle with rigor and resolve, then walked to the gurney where the boy's fingers had already bent themselves into the shape of gratitude. For half a second, Brimwood looked like a town in a better story.
Hospitals crushed time into fluorescent sameness. The boy disappeared behind curtains that snapped on rails. The man sat in a chair that had held 1,000 tired bodies and waited for news shaped like permission to exhale. The dog lay at his boots in a puddle of declining river and refused water, eyes fixed on a door as if attention alone were a medical device. Paperwork attempted to get in the way and failed under the slow authority of a police chief who had seen enough today to adjust a policy. Somewhere down the hall, voices rose, dropped, rose again. The dog did not blink. A nurse, curious and kind, paused, looked, and walked away with a small new respect tucked into her pocket. Systems shifted their weight. Files were retrieved, images printed, tags photographed, histories excavated from indifferent databases. Ava arrived with copies and a face that had held too many hard stories and still did not look away. The dog's scars became diagrams, burn pattern, restraint pattern, the telltale chafe of devices used beyond instruction. A name moved from rumor to record. The illegal pipeline unfolded, not with fireworks, but with the steady inevitability of dots connecting themselves. The man did not celebrate the correctness of his dread. He took notes as if he were still on duty and put each page away with a care that honored cost. Somewhere, someone began to think about federal jurisdiction.
Brimwood had always known how to keep its voice low when discussing its own. A father, a former Marine, a business that looked legitimate until you asked the second question. The badge at the door made asking the second question mandatory. Cuffs clicked in a hallway that echoed. The town did not cheer. It adjusted its posture in the mirror and considered what it had been willing not to see. The boy slept under monitored beeps. The dog arranged himself in an angle that covered the room's widest window, and the man leaned forward, elbows on knees, and allowed his spine a moment of complete honesty. Justice looked less like victory than maintenance. Someone still had to walk the dog before sunset. Months later, dogwoods threw white flags across Brimwood, and the creek spoke in its quieter voice again. The boy ran in a way that remembered caution without being owned by it. The dog matched him at an easy lope, moving like a poem learned by muscle. The house on Larkspur held 2 bowls and a calendar with shared weekends inked in. Nightmares arrived less frequently and left with less of the silverware. The flag on the shelf kept its counsel. On a Tuesday that felt almost impudent in its normalcy, a black SUV idled across the street, the way indifference sometimes pretends to be coincidence. The dog lifted his head, ears angling toward math not yet solved. The engine rolled away, but the question remained. Peace is not the absence of threat. It is the decision to hold the line when water rises again.